Three racist cops laughed out loud as they walked out of the courthouse, slapping each other on the back like they just won the Super Bowl. One of them even turned around and pointed at the man still sitting in silence at the defendant's table, cuffed, head bowed, alone. "That's right," the officer sneered, his voice echoing through the corridor. "Your kind don't get second chances in this city. You're done." The other two chuckled. "Let him rot. We did what we had to do. You think anybody's gonna believe a black guy over three cops?" And with that, they left, smug, careless, victorious, not knowing they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Because what they didn't know, what not even the defense attorney knew, was that the man they just threw to the wolves, was a United States Navy SEAL. That's not just a title. That's a lifetime of discipline, precision, sacrifice, and silence. A life trained to withstand the unimaginable, to break through the limits of the human mind, to fight wars no one hears about and save lives no one counts. And now, after surviving deserts, oceans, and battlefields, he found himself humiliated, right in the heart of the country he fought to protect. But this? This would be the fight of his life. Not because he couldn't handle it. But because this time, he wasn't fighting foreign enemies, he was fighting the very system that was supposed to protect him. It started on an ordinary afternoon. He was handing out hot meals and winter coats with a small non-profit, just like he'd been doing for the past 6 months since returning from service. That street corner in the inner city was familiar, even comforting, a place he used to know, before the uniform, before the blood, before the silence. He bent down to hand a warm blanket to a homeless man shivering by a bus stop when two cruisers pulled up out of nowhere. Sirens blaring, doors slamming, guns drawn. No questions. No chance to explain. "Hands up. Turn around," they screamed. People nearby froze, some pulled out their phones. But even their cameras couldn't capture what was about to happen. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding," he started, calm, respectful, trained to de-escalate. But he didn't even finish the sentence before a knee slammed into his back and his face hit the pavement. "You're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute," one of the officers growled. "We got a tip. You think we don't know what you're doing out here?" He blinked through the blood running from his nose, eyes stinging from gravel and disbelief. Tip? Distribution? He hadn't carried anything but gloves and granola bars. But when they turned out his bag, surprise, there was a tightly wrapped brick of powder he had never seen before. His heart dropped. One of them leaned down and whispered so only he could hear, "Not so invincible now, huh? Bet they treat you different where you're from. Out here, you're just another thug." And just like that, his identity was erased. Not a veteran. Not a hero. Not a man who had buried friends and risked everything for his country. No. Just another black man thrown into the system by 3 men in blue who thought they could get away with it, again. The booking photo went viral. The story spread. Local man caught selling drugs in broad daylight near shelter. No one asked questions. No one dug deeper. Why would they? The badge told the truth. The skin told the rest. The trial moved fast. Too fast. The public defender barely looked him in the eye. The evidence was overwhelming. The 3 officers testified with clean uniforms, clean smiles, and clean lies. The prosecutor made sure the jury heard about his neighborhood growing up, the music on his phone, the hoodie he wore. Not a word about his military service. Not a word about the 18-hour missions, the waterboarding he survived, the children he saved. He was invisible. But he never said a word. Not when they called him a criminal. Not when the judge denied his bail. Not when they laughed in his face as he was led out of court. Not even when he overheard one officer joke to another, "Bet he cries himself to sleep in that cell." Because a Navy SEAL doesn't panic. He plans. And while they celebrated, while they mocked, while they paraded their success around the station like they'd done something noble, he was remembering everything. Every face. Every voice. Every word they said. And he wasn't alone. Because someone had seen what happened. Someone unexpected. Someone quiet. And they had questions. Real questions. Questions that didn't match the timeline. Questions that poked holes in the story. And slowly, piece by piece, things started to shift. A forgotten camera angle. A broken chain of custody. An anonymous tip that traced back to a burner phone registered to a badge number. But none of that would matter, unless he made his move. Unless he stood up, not just to clear his name, but to take back everything they tried to strip from him. His dignity. His honor. His truth. Because what those 3 cops didn't understand, was that when you push a man like him too far, when you take everything he is and crush it under your boot, he doesn't just fight back, he dismantles everything you built. Brick by brick. Lie by lie. And when the truth comes out, it doesn't whisper. It explodes. But here's the thing, how did the judge suddenly decide to reopen the case when everything seemed already lost? What did he recognize that changed everything in that courtroom? And why did one of the officers suddenly request a transfer out of state just days before the final hearing? Something was coming. Something big. And when it hit, not a single person in that courtroom would be ready for what this man, this soldier, had prepared for them. To every black viewer watching this right now, we see you, we stand with you, and we support you. Plow of Twist stands firmly against racism, injustice, and any form of discrimination. Our stories are created to echo real emotions, real pain, and real strength, especially yours. You matter. Your story matters. Now, sit back and get ready for a journey full of twists, truth, and triumph. Don't forget to subscribe to Plow of Twist so you never miss a powerful story like this one. Let's go. Andre Johnson had always been a quiet storm, the kind of man who walked into a room and didn't have to say a word to be respected. Born and raised on the east side of Detroit, Andre wasn't just a product of his environment, he was the kind of kid who pushed back against it with everything he had. His mother, Clarice, worked double shifts as a nurse, her hands permanently worn from years of taking care of people who'd never remember her name. His father had left when Andre was 7, a goodbye letter on the table and not much else. But Clarice never let that fracture define them. She raised Andre with more love than money, more discipline than noise, and a kind of quiet dignity that Andre carried with him through every stage of his life. As a boy, Andre had a fascination with silence. While the neighborhood buzzed with sirens, music, and arguments pouring out of cracked windows, he would sit in his room and take things apart, radios, watches, anything mechanical. It wasn't just curiosity. It was control. In a world where everything felt chaotic, taking something apart and putting it back together gave him a sense of power, of peace. That same hunger for structure led him to enlist in the Navy right after high school. He didn't have a ceremony, no going-away party, just a bus ticket, a duffel bag, and his mother's tearful prayer whispered in his ear before she watched him disappear into the departure terminal. Andre didn't just survive SEAL training. He mastered it. Instructors used to say his pain threshold was inhuman, that his mind could stay calm in places other men cracked. He had that look in his eyes, the kind of stare that said, "I've been to hell, and I memorized the way back." For 12 years, he served with honor. Afghanistan. Somalia. Classified missions in countries most Americans couldn't point to on a map. He'd led squads, rescued hostages, buried brothers, and returned home with more scars on the inside than on the outside. Yet when his contract ended, he didn't re-enlist. Not because he couldn't. But because he was tired of fighting invisible wars while his people back home fought visible ones every day. Coming back to Detroit was like stepping into an old pair of boots, familiar, worn, but still functional. Andre didn't expect to be celebrated. He didn't need parades or applause. What he wanted was peace. Purpose. He found both through a small grassroots nonprofit called Hands of the City, founded by a former schoolteacher who had lost her son to gun violence. The organization served the homeless and vulnerable across some of Detroit's roughest neighborhoods: food, blankets, job referrals, and most importantly, dignity. Andre wasn't the face of the group. He didn't want to be. He packed boxes, loaded trucks, walked the streets, and spoke to men whose stories weren't that different from his. For the first time in years, he felt something like healing. But healing doesn't stop bullets. And it definitely doesn't stop prejudice. Across town, Officer Blake Hammond was sitting in a dim precinct office, spinning a pen between his fingers and staring at a stack of paperwork he had no intention of finishing. Blake had been with the department for 10 years, and in that time, his file was as thick with complaints as it was with commendations. Street smart, charming in court, and dangerous on the ground, he knew how to keep his uniform clean while his conscience got dirty. Alongside him were officers Mark Tillman and Steve Crowley, two men cut from the same cloth. They'd grown up in nearby suburbs, joined the force young, and quickly learned that the badge gave them power they never had growing up. Power they didn't deserve. They called themselves the Watchdogs when no one was listening, a little nickname for their unspoken pact. Unofficial patrols, creative arrests, and a silent understanding that they were cleaning up the city in ways the department would never publicly acknowledge. Black neighborhoods were their playground, their hunting ground, their justification. They planted evidence when necessary. Intimidated witnesses. Bent just enough of the law to get convictions, but not enough to raise alarms. And the system? It let them. So when they rolled up on the east side that cold afternoon and saw a tall black man in a gray hoodie handing something to a homeless man under the bridge, they didn't ask questions. They didn't pause to consider who he was. They saw a threat. Or maybe just an opportunity. And more importantly, they saw someone who didn't look like he belonged. Mark Tillman was the one who radioed it in as possible street distribution. Crowley pulled the patrol car in fast, tires screeching for effect. Blake stepped out last, hands already on his weapon, eyes narrow with anticipation. It was like a game to them, a performance. Andre saw them coming, but he didn't flinch. He stood slowly, hands visible, eyes calm. He tried to speak, told them he was with a nonprofit, even reached for his volunteer ID badge, but by then, they were already shouting. The homeless man had backed away, terrified, disappearing into the alley before anyone thought to ask what he'd seen. Within seconds, Andre was on the ground, his arms twisted behind him, knees pressing into his spine. They searched his bag. Crowley pulled out the wrapped brick with a theatrical gasp. "Well, would you look at that," he said with a smirk. "Guess we caught ourselves a dealer." Hammond laughed. "Another one off the streets. Write that up, boys." At the station, the paperwork was clean. Too clean. The story was simple: anonymous tip, suspicious activity, discovery of narcotics. No need for a deeper investigation. No need for background checks. No mention of his name, his service, or his record. Just another number in the system. And for Blake, Mark, and Steve, that was just how they liked it. They even joked about it later in the locker room. "Guy looked like he came out of a recruitment ad," Mark snorted. "Probably thought we'd thank him for serving or something." "Well, he's serving now," Blake replied. "Serving time." Andre sat in the holding cell that night, not because he was shocked, but because he wasn't. He had seen corruption before. He had witnessed brutality. But he never expected it to find him in this way, after everything he'd done. He replayed the moment in his head over and over. Not because he doubted himself, but because he was memorizing everything. Every word. Every gesture. Every detail. Not for revenge. Not yet. But for clarity. For precision. The arraignment came fast. His court-appointed attorney was late, distracted, and clearly overwhelmed. The judge looked bored. The prosecution played the tape of the arrest, conveniently edited. The cop sat confidently, telling the same story they'd rehearsed. And the jury, mostly white, mostly detached, listened in silence. There was no mention of Andre's record. No mention of his military honors. No testimony from the nonprofit or the people he helped. Just an image, a tall, black man in a hoodie with a duffel bag. And that image was all they needed. But something shifted on the third day. A new face entered the courtroom, the judge. Older, worn, but sharp. He looked at Andre with a strange intensity. Paused. Flipped through the file. Raised an eyebrow. Andre recognized him, but said nothing. The courtroom didn't feel it yet. But something had changed. Andre kept his head down. He didn't smile. He didn't plead. He didn't curse the system or beg for mercy. Because he knew something the rest of them didn't. This wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The courtroom had a smell, a mix of old paper, desperation, and polished wood, that clung to the air like dust on forgotten furniture. Every morning, as Andre was escorted in wearing the same beige uniform, wrists cuffed in front of him, he walked past people who didn't bother to meet his eyes. Reporters with notepads, public defenders buried in files, jurors staring straight ahead like they were on a bus ride they couldn't get off of. But every step he took was calculated. Every movement deliberate. Andre was not defeated. He was observing. Watching the pieces move, learning the tempo of the people around him. He was back on a battlefield, this one without guns, but just as dangerous. His lawyer, Brian Mercer, had only recently been assigned to the case. Young, with a good heart but little courtroom mileage, Brian had walked into the assignment reluctantly, already buried under 15 other cases. He hadn't known who Andre was at first. Just another defendant with a losing file. But something changed after the first private meeting. Andre had looked him in the eye and said, "I'm not here to beg. I'm here to expose." That line echoed in Brian's mind long after the meeting ended. So he started digging, not just into Andre's record, which left him stunned, but into the officers' testimonies, which were oddly too perfect. Every sentence between the three of them synced up like they were reading from a script. He knew police officers didn't usually talk like that. Not when they were being honest. Meanwhile, the prosecution grew increasingly confident. Blake Hammond smirked through most of his testimony, weaving a story about catching Andre red-handed during a routine patrol. Mark Tillman backed it up with subtle nods and that tone of righteous authority juries tend to trust. Steve Crowley, quieter but no less smug, painted the nonprofit as a possible front for organized distribution. Their narrative was airtight, their attitude untouchable. But underneath the arrogance, there were cracks. Brian noticed that Blake seemed to steer away from specifics when pressed. That Tillman kept darting his eyes toward Crowley, as if looking for confirmation mid-testimony. And Crowley? Crowley flinched, barely noticeable, when Brian mentioned the chain of custody regarding the evidence bag. Andre said little throughout. But when he did speak, the room changed. His voice didn't tremble. It carried a calm weight that made even the bailiff straighten up. He spoke of his work with the nonprofit, the people he'd helped, the nights he spent loading trucks with food and clothing. He explained the mission, not in a way that sought sympathy, but in a tone so factual it left no room for embellishment. You ever seen a man freeze to death with a bag of chips in his hand because he had nowhere to go? He asked the jury at one point, his eyes scanning each of them. I have. That's why I do what I do. There was silence. Even the prosecutor didn't interrupt. Outside the courtroom, things began to stir. Local journalist Maya Ellis, who had once interviewed Andre for a veteran-focused piece years ago, came across his name in a small news article about the arrest. The mugshot didn't match the man she remembered, the composed, decorated SEAL who had saved lives abroad and returned home only to serve his community in silence. She reached out to the nonprofit. She talked to people on the streets, found volunteers who had worked beside him that day. Their stories didn't match the police report. Not even close. Maya began writing, slowly unraveling the public version of the truth, and her online piece began gaining traction. The headline read, "The Seal the City Forgot." Word traveled. A retired SEAL, Marcus Tex Hayes, one of Andre's old teammates, got wind of the story. Tex didn't do politics or press, but loyalty. That was sacred. He flew into Detroit without calling ahead, walked into the courtroom during a recess, and sat silently in the back. His presence wasn't loud, but Andre saw him. Their eyes met. A small nod passed between them. Reinforcements had arrived. Inside the precinct, things were shifting too. Officer Rodriguez, one of the few in the department who didn't align with the watchdogs, started asking quiet questions. She'd always found their behavior troubling, but she had stayed silent, like many others, afraid of retaliation. But something about this case, about the way they laughed in the hallway after the first day of trial, about the way Blake had bragged that, "This one's a wrap, we're bulletproof," made her stomach turn. One night, she stayed late and accessed the body cam server. She knew some of the footage had gone missing. But a backup server had been recently installed for pilot testing. With trembling hands, she pulled the files. What she found didn't prove everything, but it proved enough. Gaps in the timeline. A mysterious jump in the footage. Evidence of tampering. She downloaded it. Saved it. And then she waited. Andre remained patient, but the fire inside him burned hotter by the day. He wasn't sleeping much. Memories of missions he couldn't talk about haunted him less than the betrayal happening right in front of him. One night, in the cold stillness of his cell, he stood under the flickering light and whispered, "You trained for war. You survived war. But this is the war that matters." The guard watching from the other side couldn't hear him. But he didn't need to. As the trial continued, Brian requested a subpoena for the full footage from all three officers' body cams. The prosecution fought it, said the files were already submitted in full. But the judge, now more alert, ordered a review. When the files arrived, there were inconsistencies. Time stamps that didn't match up. Blurry transitions. Strange silences. And then, a miracle, not in the courtroom, but online. Maya's article exploded. Thousands of shares. Comments from people who knew Andre, who vouched for his integrity. Veterans, non-profit members, even a local pastor chimed in. The narrative was shifting, and for the first time, the city started asking if maybe, just maybe, they'd gotten it wrong. But the watchdogs weren't blind to the change in temperature. Blake met with Mark and Steve in a dim parking garage after court. "We stick to the story. No matter what," he said, his voice low. "We've come too far to backpedal now." Mark hesitated. "There's chatter. People talking. That reporter's digging deep." Steve stayed quiet. Blake noticed. "You got something to say?" Steve looked away. "No. I'm good." But he wasn't. Steve hadn't slept in days. The guilt was crawling into his bones. And it was starting to show. The tension bled into the courtroom. Brian called on a surprise witness, a woman named Teresa, a volunteer who had worked with Andre the day of the arrest. She wasn't a public speaker, but her words were clear. "I was with him all morning. We handed out blankets and water bottles. He never left my sight." The prosecution tried to rattle her. She didn't budge. She had nothing to gain. Just the truth. The judge leaned forward slightly now, brow furrowed, clearly disturbed. The jury shifted. Something was happening. Something subtle. But undeniable. In the hallway, after another long day, Andre walked past Officer Rodriguez. Their eyes met briefly. She gave him a small nod. It wasn't a smile. It was a signal. And that night, a package was slipped under Brian's office door, an unmarked USB drive. He plugged it in. What he saw made his hands go cold. Because on that drive, was the reason this trial would never be the same again. But what, exactly, was on that footage? And why did the judge stare so long at Andre that day, like he recognized something he wasn't supposed to? The answer was coming. And when it arrived, it would tear the entire courtroom apart. It was raining that morning, not a storm, not enough to drench, but just enough for the drops to tap rhythmically against the courthouse windows like they were warning everyone inside that something was about to break. The courtroom lights flickered briefly as people settled into their places, and there was a strange, almost palpable shift in the air. Andre sat still, wrists resting on the table in front of him, his eyes calm, his posture straight. He wore no expression, gave no hint of what was coming. But inside, something had already turned. He had watched silently for days, had let the world write him off, let men who had no idea who he was try to bury him alive, and now, the reckoning had arrived. Brian entered with more weight in his steps, his suit slightly wrinkled, a deep line of exhaustion across his forehead, but his eyes were alive, sharp, brimming with something the courtroom hadn't seen in him before. He carried only one thing in his hand, a flash drive. No stack of papers, no notes. Just that. The prosecutor barely looked up, too busy prepping another round of smug objections and recycled statements. Blake Hammond and his partner sat on the witness bench, whispering low with their lawyer, eyes scanning the room like men who were confident the ending had already been written. But they didn't know what was on that drive. They didn't know what had been uncovered. And they definitely didn't know who the judge really was. As proceedings began, the judge's voice echoed through the chamber. Deeper than usual. Measured. Counsel, you may proceed. Brian stood slowly, his voice steady but deliberate. He didn't start with a speech. He didn't perform. He walked to the evidence screen and inserted the flash drive. The projector buzzed to life. The lights dimmed. The first frame froze in silence, a timestamp, a blurred sidewalk, a faint figure in a hoodie. Brian turned slightly to the jury. What you're about to see was recovered from a backup system not listed in the original evidence log. It was recorded unintentionally. Which is why it wasn't deleted along with the rest. The video began to play. The courtroom leaned forward. At first, the footage was shaky, taken from a wide-angled building camera across the street. It showed Andre, clearly seen handing out items, gloves, water bottles, to people sitting along the sidewalk. Then came the patrol car. It didn't just roll in. It swerved. The doors burst open before the car had fully stopped. Blake Hammond charged forward. Andre raised his hands immediately. There was no resistance. No sudden movements. No sign of wrongdoing. Then came the twist. Another camera angle, side view, caught it all, Officer Crowley reaching into Andre's duffel bag, his body blocking the view. Seconds later, his hand re-emerged, holding a tightly wrapped object. Gasps erupted from the jury box. The judge leaned in, frowning now. Brian let it play a moment longer, then paused. We submitted this footage to an independent analyst to verify its authenticity. The timestamps match. The metadata is untouched. What you just witnessed was the moment the prosecution's key evidence was planted. In plain sight. The silence was electric. Blake's face, once relaxed, tensed instantly. Mark shifted in his seat, pale now. Crowley froze. The prosecutor stood to object, but the judge raised a hand, stopping him cold. Let him finish. Brian stepped forward. Your Honor, in light of this footage, we ask for an immediate re-examination of Officer Hammond's testimony. And in addition, we request permission to call a surprise witness, one whose identity and credentials may clarify the significance of this trial beyond this room. The judge narrowed his eyes, then gave a slow nod. Proceed. The back doors opened. A hush fell across the room. Into the silence walked a man in full military uniform. Rows of medals glinted against his chest, and a slow murmur of recognition rippled through the room. The man approached the stand without hesitation. As he turned to face the courtroom, the judge stared at him with eyes wide and lips slightly parted. The man saluted sharply. Commander Marcus Hayes. Retired Navy SEAL. I served with the defendant during 3 active combat deployments. The room shifted again. This wasn't just a character witness. This was a man who had bled beside Andre. Who had seen what he was made of. Brian moved to the front. Commander Hayes, do you know the man seated at the defense table? Yes. He's a decorated SEAL. 2 silver stars. 5 deployments. Highest clearance level. He saved my life in Ghazni province. I wouldn't be standing here if not for him. Were you aware of the charges against him? I was. That's why I flew here. Because they're impossible. And I don't say that lightly. I've seen Andre crawl through death to protect people who hated him. This man does not lie. He does not deal. He does not run. He saves. The weight of the words hung in the air like iron. The jury sat speechless. Even the reporters had stopped typing. Then, something happened no one expected. The judge slowly removed his glasses and spoke. His voice was low, but carried enough gravity to still the room. I know him too. Everyone turned toward the bench. In 2009, my daughter was working for an international aid group. Her convoy was taken hostage by insurgents. I received the call that she likely wouldn't survive the night. But that night, a team of Navy SEALs went in, disobeyed the risk protocols, and brought every single hostage out alive. The team leader's name was Andre Johnson. The courtroom unraveled. People looked at Andre differently now, not as a defendant, not as an accused man, but as something else entirely. And in that moment, the shame didn't belong to him anymore. It belonged to every person who had dismissed his worth without question. Blake shot up from his seat. This is insane. This has nothing to do with, but before he could finish, Crowley stood up too. His face was pale, sweat trickling down his temple. I can't, he muttered, voice cracking. I can't lie anymore. Gasps again. The room froze. All eyes turned to him. I didn't know what they were doing. Not at first. But then. I saw Hammond slip the bag in. I should have stopped it. I should have said something. But I was afraid. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The prosecutor turned red. Hammond's jaw tightened. He looked at Mark, who avoided his gaze. The foundation was crumbling. Everything they built, the lies, the confidence, the certainty, was falling apart under the weight of one man's silence, now finally broken. The judge called an immediate recess. The courtroom burst into chaos, voices overlapping, news cameras rolling, reporters swarming. But Andre sat still, his hands resting in his lap. Calm. Centered. Because for the first time in weeks, maybe longer, the war inside him had shifted. But this wasn't the end. Not yet. Because what the prosecution didn't know, what the city didn't yet understand, was that Andre had more than just a story to clear his name. He had a mission. And when the courtroom reconvened, the next move would not only destroy the lies. It would expose the system that allowed them to exist. What came next would change everything. When the courtroom reconvened, the storm wasn't just outside anymore, it was alive inside those walls. The air was thick with something far more powerful than noise, exposure. Truth, now uncovered, sat in every corner of the room, heavy like smoke after a fire. The judge's eyes had changed. The jurors had changed. Even the court reporter paused before setting her fingers back on the keys. Andre walked back to his seat with his shoulders squared, not in defiance, but in quiet strength. Not a single movement wasted. Not a single glance given to the men who had tried to erase him. There was no need. That part was already falling apart on its own. Crowley sat to the side now, separated from his former partners, a glass of water untouched beside him, his hands trembling slightly as he held a crumpled tissue. He didn't look at anyone. Hammond, however, was still trying to play the role. He whispered to his lawyer, gesturing sharply, his jaw clenched like a man trying to force the earth to stop spinning by sheer will. Mark Tillman stared down at his lap, saying nothing, like a child realizing for the first time that the world would no longer protect him just because it used to. And in the middle of it all, Andre sat still, a calm center in the storm, the eye of the hurricane they never saw coming. The judge leaned forward, his voice lower than before, deliberate. "Mr. Mercer. You may continue." Brian stood with a controlled breath, holding a folder in one hand but not opening it. His eyes scanned the courtroom before settling on the jury. "We're not just here to prove my client's innocence anymore," he began, his tone rich with something heavier than legal rhetoric. "We're here to reveal how easy it is to destroy a man when the system is built to never see him as human in the first place." He turned and pointed, not at the officers, but at the table where the evidence bags had been displayed just days ago. They didn't need to work hard. One camera turned off. One false report. 3 matching testimonies. That's all it took. But the man they picked. He wasn't just any man. He had discipline. Memory. A history of surviving things these men could never even imagine. And more than that, he had a city watching now. He paused, then turned to Crowley. "Officer Crowley. Would you like to continue your testimony?" Crowley looked at the judge, at his lawyer, then at Andre. For a moment, he seemed frozen. Then his voice cracked out, dry and brittle. "I knew it was wrong. When Blake planted the evidence, I wanted to speak up. But they said it was already done. That no one would believe him anyway. They told me if I tried to talk, I'd lose everything. My job. My pension. My life. I stayed quiet. And I was wrong." Brian nodded slightly. "Why do you think they felt so confident?" Crowley swallowed hard. "Because it wasn't the first time. Not for them. They'd done this before. Different names. Same story. Always someone they thought no one would fight for." The room gasped, a ripple of shock coursing through the gallery. Blake slammed his hand on the table, shouting, "You liar. You spineless piece of," but the judge immediately banged the gavel, cutting him off with a stern glare. "You are dangerously close to contempt, Officer Hammond. Sit down and stay silent unless spoken to." Brian turned, walking slowly across the room. "Let's be very clear about what just happened. This wasn't about one moment of poor judgment. This was a machine. A practiced, rehearsed, systemic machine. And if it weren't for one man's integrity finally breaking through the silence, none of you would have seen it." Andre stood. Not because he had to, but because it was time. The judge looked toward him. "Mr. Johnson. You have something to add?" Andre walked slowly to the front. No cuffs. No escort. Just the quiet sound of his boots against the floor. He stood in front of the jury, not as a defendant anymore, but as a man reclaiming his place. "I spent 12 years learning how to survive," he said, his voice steady, the words cutting through the silence like wind through still water. "Not just on battlefields. But in places where people don't think twice about who you are. Where your skin makes you a target before your actions are ever seen. I learned how to read danger before it spoke. I learned that some wars don't end when you come home. They just look different." He looked toward the officers, not with hate, but with clarity. "They didn't know who I was. But it wouldn't have mattered. Because in their eyes, I was already guilty. Not for what I did. But for what I looked like. They thought I'd stay quiet. That I'd let the world tell my story for me. But I've never done that. Not once. And I'm not starting now. A pause. A breath. And then he turned back to the jury. You were told I was dangerous. You were shown edited clips and incomplete reports. You were asked to believe in a version of me that was created by men who had power and no conscience. But the truth? The real truth, is that I don't want revenge. I want restoration. Not just for me. But for every name that never got a second look. Every voice that was silenced before it had a chance to speak. He returned to his seat. The courtroom was absolutely still. No coughs. No shuffles. Just silence, as if the very walls were listening too. The judge cleared his throat, leaned into his microphone, and spoke with finality. This court will reconvene tomorrow for closing statements and a ruling. Until then, court is adjourned. As the room began to stir and people stood, Andre felt a hand lightly touch his shoulder. It was Commander Hayes. You've already won, he whispered. They just don't know it yet. Outside, reporters flooded the steps. Maya stood to the side, notebook clutched to her chest, tears in her eyes. Not from sadness, from justice that, for once, felt possible. Officer Rodriguez watched from a distance, knowing that the footage she'd released would likely cost her career, but looking at Andre, she knew it was worth it. Back in the hallway, Mark Tillman approached Crowley slowly, his voice hushed, his eyes tired. We should have stopped him, he muttered. Crowley looked at him for a long moment. No. We should have never followed him in the first place. Inside the judge's chamber, alone now, the judge sat at his desk, staring at a photograph of his daughter beside a man in uniform. That man, still young, still strong, was Andre Johnson. The judge closed the file, his hand lingering on it. A storm had passed through his courtroom. And what remained now, was truth. But morning was coming. And with it, a decision that would ripple far beyond that courtroom. Because this wasn't just a case anymore. It was a moment in history. By the time the sun broke through the clouds the next morning, the courthouse steps were already lined with people, some holding signs, some in silent protest, some simply watching. The news vans had multiplied overnight, cameras pointed at the grand double doors like something historic might walk out of them at any moment. Inside, the atmosphere was different now. It wasn't just tension anymore. It was awareness. People entered the courtroom slower, quieter, like they understood the weight of what had unfolded. No one checked their phones, no one whispered. The room had been transformed into a space where consequences now lived, and every seat carried the echo of something irreversible. The bailiff barely had to say a word for silence to fall into place. Andre entered without shackles. There was no bailiff holding his arm, no tight grip at his elbow. He wore a simple dress shirt, borrowed from Brian's own closet, and sat with his hands folded neatly in front of him. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look satisfied. He just looked ready. And maybe a little tired, not the kind of tired that sleep could fix, but the kind that comes after years of holding your breath in a world that keeps trying to crush you just for breathing. The judge took the bench with a slow, deliberate pace, his expression unreadable. The jury filed in, eyes heavy, their movements stiff from the gravity of what they now understood they were part of. But before the closing statements could begin, the prosecutor stood, clearing his throat. He asked to address the court privately, which triggered a ripple of confusion through the room. The judge allowed it. 10 minutes later, the lawyers returned, and the prosecutor's demeanor had shifted entirely. He no longer carried the righteous authority he'd wielded just days ago. His shoulders slumped slightly. His eyes avoided the crowd. When he stood to speak, his voice didn't rise to command attention. Instead, it barely carried across the room. He stated that the district attorney's office had reviewed the footage submitted, confirmed the analysis, and found sufficient grounds to open a broader investigation into misconduct. He acknowledged the credibility of the witnesses who had come forward and formally withdrew the charges against Andre Johnson. The words were delivered with practiced restraint, but the effect was immediate. People didn't cheer, not yet, because what had happened wasn't something to celebrate. It was something to absorb. As the judge turned to Andre, silence settled again. His voice was calm, but there was something new behind it, something harder. Mr. Johnson, this court recognizes your service, your integrity, and your perseverance in the face of injustice. Your case represents a failure of the system, one that must be addressed beyond these walls. You are hereby fully exonerated, and this court extends its apologies for the harm you've endured. Then, after a pause, his voice dropped slightly, more personal. And I thank you. Not just for your service overseas, but for your patience here, where so many others would have been broken. The gavel struck. The moment was official. Andre stood. People began to rise slowly around him, not in applause, but in silent acknowledgement. Eyes welled with tears. Strangers nodded to him like he was someone they knew, not because they actually did, but because something in his story felt too familiar. A quiet truth about dignity surviving even when the world forgets how to recognize it. Andre didn't smile. He simply nodded once, respectfully, and walked out of the courtroom like a man stepping out of the fire, not burned, but forged. Outside, the media swarmed. Microphones were shoved forward, questions shouted over each other, flashes blinding. Andre paused at the top of the steps. Maya stepped forward first, gently, holding no recorder, just her notepad. "Do you want to say anything?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Andre looked out at the sea of faces. He took a breath, then said, "I didn't come here to make noise. I came here to speak truth. What happened to me has happened to too many others. Most of them don't get cameras. Most don't get a second chance. If my story matters now, let it be because it made people start asking better questions." Then he turned, walked down the steps, and disappeared into the crowd. But the story didn't end there. Inside the police department, the atmosphere had shifted violently. Rodriguez had been suspended for leaking the footage, but by the next morning, over a dozen officers had signed a letter in her defense. A quiet rebellion had begun within the ranks, young officers who'd grown tired of pretending the system was fine just because they feared the backlash of telling the truth. The mayor's office called an emergency press conference. Civil rights attorneys began circling the department like sharks smelling blood. Investigations were launched. Public records were reopened. Files long buried were suddenly being pulled and re-examined. Mark Tillman resigned within the week. No statement. No press. Just a single envelope left on the chief's desk. Crowley entered witness protection shortly after, agreeing to testify in a federal investigation in exchange for immunity. His family had received threats. Online forums painted him as a traitor. But he knew he had done the only thing that would let him sleep at night. As for Blake Hammond, he was indicted on multiple counts: evidence tampering, perjury, abuse of power. His lawyer tried to argue it was procedural pressure, that he had been trapped by the culture of his department. But the footage said otherwise. The footage, and the sound of his voice recorded on an internal mic whispering, "No one's ever gonna believe him anyway." Andre stayed out of the spotlight. He declined interviews. He turned down a book deal. Instead, he went back to hands of the city, back to the streets he knew. But now, the people who passed him didn't look at him the same way. They stopped to thank him. To ask him for guidance. Some even cried. One young boy walked up to him and asked, "Are you really that soldier from the video?" Andre kneeled down, looked the boy in the eye, and said, "I'm just a man who didn't stay quiet." But inside him, a question began to form. One he hadn't voiced, not even to Brian, not to Commander Hayes, not to the few friends he had left. A question that gnawed at the edges of his thoughts late at night. What would have happened if he wasn't a Navy SEAL? Would they have cared? Would anyone have listened? It was a haunting thought, not for what it said about his own case, but what it implied about thousands of others. Brian, now regarded as a rising legal voice in civil rights litigation, approached Andre one day and said, "You could sue them. You'd win. You'd be a national story. You could make sure this never happens again." Andre looked out at the city skyline, the clouds hanging heavy in the distance. "If I go down that road," he said slowly, "I become part of their story. I want to build something that's mine. Something they can't touch." "But don't you want justice?" Brian asked. Andre looked him in the eye. "I am justice. The fact that I'm still here, that's justice. But what I want now, is legacy." And with that, he turned back to his work, back to the people who still needed help, still needed someone to believe in them when no one else would. But the world was watching now. And the system that once looked unshakable had a crack, one that had been widened not by rage, but by resilience. Andre Johnson didn't just survive. He changed the ground beneath him. And it was only just beginning. 2 weeks after the courtroom turned into a battlefield for truth, Andre stood in the back alley of a community center on the east side of the city, a shovel in one hand and sweat sliding down his brow. The building was being expanded, 2 new classrooms, 1 job training space, and a transitional housing wing for young veterans. He wasn't just helping, he was leading. No cameras, no microphones. Just bricks, sweat, and purpose. The world around him might have changed, but Andre hadn't forgotten what still needed to be done. He hadn't spoken publicly since the trial. Every invitation to appear on talk shows, podcasts, award ceremonies, he turned them down. People called it humility. It wasn't. It was clarity. He knew that attention was temporary. But change? Change needed consistency. It needed someone who would still show up after the spotlight was gone. Later that afternoon, inside the center's main hall, Andre sat across from a teenage boy named Malik, who had recently been released from juvenile detention after serving time for a crime he didn't commit. The two sat in silence for a while. Malik fidgeted with the hem of his sleeve, unsure of how to start. Finally, Andre broke the silence. "You're not broken, Malik," he said, his voice steady. "You've been bruised, yeah, but you're not broken." Malik scoffed, looking away. "How would you know?" Andre didn't hesitate. "Because I've been exactly where you are. Except my prison had medals on the walls. My cell had people who smiled to my face and buried knives in my back. But I got out. You can too." Malik looked at him, eyes narrow. "They all keep saying I gotta let it go. Forgive. How am I supposed to forgive people who made me feel like I didn't even exist?" Andre nodded slowly, letting the words settle before answering. "You don't forgive them for them. You do it for yourself. So you don't carry their poison in your chest every night. You think they deserve your peace. They don't. But you do." That conversation would replay in Malik's mind over and over in the months that followed. And just like Andre had hoped, it planted something. Not resolve. Not clarity. Just a seed, but that was enough. Meanwhile, the investigation into the Detroit Police Department widened. A federal task force moved in. Internal Affairs brought in external monitors. Body cam policies were rewritten. And for the first time, several older cases involving false arrests were reopened. Victims began to speak up, not because they believed they'd get justice, but because they'd seen someone do it and survive. Andre's case had lit a fire, but it was the quiet echo of his endurance that continued to spread. One night, while Andre sat alone inside the empty center, flipping through a folder of volunteer applications, the door creaked open. He didn't look up right away. Then a familiar voice stopped him cold. "You built all this from nothing." Andre looked up to find Steve Crowley standing in the doorway, hat in hand, eyes sunken. There was no anger in Andre's face, just caution. Crowley stepped in slowly, hands visible, nervous like a man who didn't know if he deserved to speak. "I've been trying to find the right way to say this," he said, his voice low and uneven, "but I realize there isn't one. I don't want to hide anymore. I didn't come to ask for anything. I needed to face you." Andre stayed silent, letting Crowley fill the space with whatever he had to give. Crowley took a deep breath. "I still hear your voice in the back of my head, from that day, when you were on the ground and you said you didn't do anything. I knew it was true. But I didn't stop them. And every time I see my reflection, that's the face I see, the one of a coward. I betrayed everything I thought I believed in." Andre finally spoke. "Why now?" Crowley looked down. "Because if someone like me can live free after what I did, and someone like you had to fight to prove you belonged in your own skin, then something in the world's backward. And I either stay part of the problem, or I spend the rest of my life trying to flip it." There was a long pause. Andre stood up slowly, walked over, and stood just inches from Crowley. They were face to face now, no uniforms, no titles, just two men caught on opposite sides of a truth too long denied. Andre's voice was low, but it carried the kind of weight that left no room for performance. "You can't undo what's done. You can't unplant what was planted. But you can choose who you become after. Redemption isn't asking to be forgiven. It's earning the right to walk upright again. That's your burden now. You want to flip the world? Start by flipping your reflection." Crowley nodded, his eyes moist, lips trembling. "Thank you," he whispered, and turned to leave. That night, Andre stayed in the center long after the lights were off, staring out the window into the quiet street. He thought about the officer who walked in, about the boy earlier that day, about his own face reflected in the glass, and for the first time in a long time, the reflection didn't look like a man waiting to be vindicated. It looked like a man building something real. Meanwhile, Brian was knee-deep in civil cases, class actions now being filed by families who had long since given up on justice. He reached out to Andre one night, asking if he'd be willing to appear in a video message to support the new coalition of victims. Andre listened, respectfully. Then he said, "I'll help however I can. But I won't be the symbol they parade. My voice is loud now because the system tried to silence it. But if I'm the only one talking, then we've failed again. I want people like Malik to speak. I want those who were never believed to be heard. I'll stand behind them. But I won't stand in their place." Brian smiled softly. "You've always known the difference between power and presence." To which Andre replied, "Because I've had both used against me." As summer bled into fall, the city changed slowly. The police department faced more scrutiny than ever before. Blake Hammond sat in a federal courtroom with a completely different jury now, and this time, he was the defendant. His confidence was gone. His arrogance reduced to silence. Andre didn't attend the trial. He didn't need to. Justice had already left its mark. The walls that once silenced the truth now echoed with accountability. But the most powerful moment came one day during a community summit organized by Hands of the City. Dozens of people packed into the space, educators, residents, former inmates, veterans, students. Andre sat off to the side, quietly observing. Then, during the Q&A session, a young girl about 11 years old raised her hand and asked, "How do you stop being afraid of people who wear uniforms?" The room froze. All eyes turned to Andre. Slowly, he stood, walked to the front, and knelt to be eye level with her. "You don't," he said gently. "You learn to see them for what they are, people. Some good. Some broken. Some scared, just like you. But you don't let that fear decide who you become. Fear's a shadow. It follows you, but it doesn't have to lead." And just like that, the room exhaled. Later that night, Andre walked alone through the city, past the alley where he was first arrested, past the blocks that had changed him. He paused under a flickering streetlight, took a long breath, and whispered into the empty night, "Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you rebuild while they're still watching." Because even in silence, Andre Johnson was still speaking, to the city, to the system, to every single person who'd ever been told they were invisible. And they were finally listening. The first winter after the trial came faster than anyone expected. Cold swept through Detroit in early November like a silent reminder that change, no matter how hopeful, would always come with resistance. The city looked the same on the surface, same streets, same skyline, same worn bricks and weathered signs, but underneath, something had shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't the kind of revolution you read about in history books. It was quieter, heavier, more human. People talked differently now. They paused before passing judgment. They remembered Andre Johnson's face, not because the media told them to, but because something about what happened to him stuck to the bones. It had forced the city to confront itself. Inside the center, the air was warm, thick with the smell of hot soup and old books. Andre sat in the corner of a multipurpose room-turned-library, a notebook open in front of him, but his mind elsewhere. Across the room, an older man named Wallace, a Vietnam vet who had been homeless for years before joining the center, was sitting with Malik, teaching him how to repair a radio. It was a strange but beautiful sight, two generations bound not by blood, but by battle. Malik was more focused now, more present. He hadn't gotten into a fight in weeks. He showed up every morning before the doors even opened. It wasn't a transformation you could see in headlines, but Andre noticed it in the small things, the way Malik held eye contact now, the way he shook hands firmly, the way he smiled like it wasn't a crime to be soft sometimes. Later that day, while organizing donations in the back, Andre received an unexpected visit. Brian stepped in with a folder under his arm and that half-smile he wore when he had something big to say but wasn't sure how Andre would take it. "They offered you a settlement," he said. 7 figures. A full public apology. Backdated recognition. Everything you're entitled to. Andre didn't even pause what he was doing. "That's not why I did this." Brian already knew the answer, but he pushed anyway. "You could use the money to expand the center. Buy buildings. Fund programs. Create scholarships in your name. You wouldn't be selling out, Andre. You'd be reinvesting." Andre stopped, looked at him, and said, "They want to pay me to let it go. But I don't want their money to buy their comfort. I want their discomfort to live a little longer. Let them sit with it." Brian sighed, nodding. "You know, there are people out there saying you're the face of a movement. That you've become a symbol." Andre leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Symbols get worshipped or destroyed. I'm not trying to be either. I want to stay real enough that people still listen when I speak. Not because of what I represent. But because of what I've survived." That night, Andre stayed late again. The center had quieted down. Outside, the snow had started to fall, soft and slow. He stepped onto the sidewalk to clear the entrance. Halfway through, he saw a familiar figure standing across the street. At first, he thought it was a ghost, some reflection from the past. But as the figure stepped forward under the glow of the street lamp, he realized it was Mark Tillman. No badge. No uniform. Just a heavy winter coat and a man's face carrying too many sleepless nights. Andre didn't speak. He just watched as Mark approached slowly, hands raised slightly like he was still unsure if he was allowed to be there. Mark stopped just a few feet away. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, voice hoarse from the cold or guilt or both. "But I came because I need to look you in the eye and say something that no courtroom forced me to say. I was a coward. I let that badge make me believe I was untouchable. I saw what Blake was doing. I saw how he changed after our first few years on the job. And I followed. Not because I believed in it, but because it was easier. And you were the one who paid for that ease. Andre didn't interrupt. He let him speak because silence, sometimes, was the only truth worth offering. Mark continued. I lost my job. My pension. I'm under investigation now. Everything's gone. But I deserved that. What I didn't expect, was how much I'd lose inside. The worst part isn't being stripped of a title. It's realizing I was never the man I thought I was. He paused, breathing heavy, watching his breath fog in front of him. I know I don't deserve your time. But I had to say this. You changed more than a courtroom. You changed me. And if there's any way, someday, to make even 1 ounce of that right, I want to. Andre's jaw tightened. His eyes, locked on Mark's, didn't soften, but they didn't harden either. What you do next, he said finally, matters more than what you did before. I don't have space in my life for the old you. But the man you're trying to be? Maybe he has a chance. Not with me. With the world you helped break. Mark nodded, swallowing hard, then turned and disappeared back into the snow. Andre watched him go, then looked up at the sky. The snowflakes were thicker now, dancing in spirals as they fell. There was something poetic about it. The way the world tried to cover what was raw, tried to make it beautiful even when the ground underneath was still cracked. The next morning, Andre received a letter. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It read, Your strength saved more than just yourself. My daughter asks about you now. Not with fear. But with hope. Thank you. There was no signature. But Andre knew who it was from. The judge. The same man who had watched him stand alone in a courtroom and remembered a moment years ago when Andre had risked his life for someone he didn't even know. That circle had closed quietly. No spotlight. No parade. Just one sentence that meant more than an entire press conference ever could. Weeks passed. The holidays came. The center filled with laughter, with music, with new coats and handmade cards. Andre was offered an honorary degree from a local university. He declined the ceremony, but offered to come speak with students instead. That day, in a room full of young black men, he was asked by one student, "What's the one thing they couldn't take from you?" Andre paused. Then he said, "The truth. It's the one weapon they don't know how to handle. It doesn't need a badge or a bench or a broadcast. It just needs to be told." And in that moment, the student didn't see a victim. He saw a blueprint. Because that was what Andre had become now. Not a hero. Not a martyr. A blueprint for survival with dignity. For resistance without rage. For justice without revenge. But more than anything, for rebuilding a life when the world tried to tear it down. And he wasn't done yet. Not even close. Spring arrived with quiet footsteps, brushing away the frozen grief that winter had left behind. Detroit felt different now, not louder, not brighter, but somehow more awake. The wind carried a deeper kind of silence, the kind that follows truth after it's been spoken and heard. On the streets, change didn't roar, it whispered. And in those whispers, lives began to transform. Inside the newly renovated wing of the Hands of the city center, a brass plaque hung near the entrance that read, "Built not in revenge, but in resilience." In honor of those who stood, when silence was easier. Below the inscription was a name etched in gold, Andre D. Johnson. Andre never asked for that plaque. It was placed there by the community, people he had fed, taught, protected, and inspired. He kept showing up every day. Teaching life skills. Guiding kids like Malik toward paths they hadn't considered before. When city officials offered to name a street after him, he suggested they use the money to open a literacy program instead. When national media tried to feature him in a documentary, he redirected the spotlight to the volunteers who had supported the mission since the beginning. His legacy wasn't built on spectacle. It was carved out of patience, grit, and a refusal to disappear. Brian took on a permanent role as a civil rights advocate, leading a team that focused on cases involving law enforcement corruption. His reputation grew, but he never took a case without first remembering the face of the man who taught him what justice should look like. Every win in court reminded him of the moment when the truth first cracked through the system. And while the world saw him as a rising legal star, Brian knew that the light he carried didn't come from him, it came from walking alongside someone who refused to bow to injustice. Steve Crowley, relocated and living under a new identity, eventually began teaching ethics classes to young officers under a federal reform program. It was part of his deal, but it became more than that. Every lecture felt like a penance. He never mentioned Andre's name, but every lesson was shaped by the shadow of what he had once been too afraid to fight against. In private moments, he wrote letters he never sent, some to Andre, others to families he'd wronged. He knew redemption wasn't something he could claim. It was something he would have to build, quietly, every single day. Mark Tillman disappeared from public life entirely. Rumors spread that he'd moved to a small town upstate, working in a mechanic shop under a different name. But what no one knew was that every Saturday, he visited a local youth center and volunteered as a janitor, refusing pay. He didn't talk much. Didn't teach or preach. But sometimes, when a kid asked why he scrubbed toilets without a job title, he'd say, because some things can't be cleaned with words. He didn't seek forgiveness. He just wanted to carry weight in a way that felt honest. Blake Hammond's trial ended in conviction. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. He was sentenced to 15 years without parole. As he was led out of the courtroom, cuffed and silent, he passed by a mural painted across the side of the courthouse, one that hadn't been there when his reign of abuse began. It depicted hands of different colors rising from concrete, forming a chain. In the middle, barely visible unless you looked close, was a single man in silhouette, standing. It wasn't labeled. It didn't need to be. Blake didn't look twice. Because for the first time, he understood that the silence of a man like Andre Johnson had more power than his years of shouting and posturing ever could. As for Andre, something rare happened one early morning. He was sitting alone in the center, reviewing intake forms, when a courier arrived with an envelope bearing a White House seal. Inside was an invitation to be honored with a Presidential Medal of Civil Service. It came with travel, media, cameras. Andre read the letter twice. Then he folded it, placed it gently in his drawer, and went back to helping an elderly woman with her food stamp application. Later that week, he called the office and respectfully declined. "I've already been honored," he told the aide on the phone. "Every time someone walks through these doors and sees themselves as more than what the world told them they were." One evening, while closing up the center, Malik asked him something he'd never asked before. "Do you think things really change, or do we just get better at surviving them?" Andre thought for a long moment. Then he said, "I think the world changes one person at a time. And when those people stop surviving and start building, that's when it sticks. Surviving is step one. Rebuilding is how you win." And that's what Andre Johnson did. He won. Not by tearing down the world that tried to erase him. But by outlasting it. By standing taller, working harder, loving deeper. He never sought revenge. He never shouted. He just became undeniable. A name they couldn't silence. A story they couldn't rewrite. And most importantly, a man who didn't just reclaim his life, he transformed it into something bigger than justice. He turned pain into foundation. He turned rage into mentorship. He turned trauma into a blueprint. Now let me ask you, the one listening. How many people around you have stories you've never heard? How many truths have you passed by because the world trained you to look the other way? What if you are the voice someone is waiting to hear? What if your silence is costing someone else their chance at freedom? Andre Johnson's story is not just a story. It's a reminder that we are responsible not just for what we do, but for what we allow. That justice isn't a gift handed down, it's something we fight for, protect, and build with our bare hands. One action at a time. One truth at a time. One choice at a time. If this story made you feel something, anger, hope, reflection, purpose, tell us. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done if you were in Andre's place? And more importantly, what will you do now? Make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories like this one, stories that don't just entertain, but shake something loose inside you. If this hit you hard, leave a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Until next time, keep your ears open, your heart sharp, and your truth louder than the silence.